like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, it seems like you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got it's like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all
All right, AgNONsis, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Not too bad, not too bad. Pretty typical day, I guess. It's been good weather, so.
Yeah,
Can't
honestly,
complain.
at least in like the American Southeast, the weather has been great for like a month. And normally August, September are 100 degrees, miserable. And it's, the sort of summer you can actually, enjoy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, man, it's been lovely to have an actual summer instead of just a 3-month period where you just hang out inside. But so you and I got connected, I believe through a mutual friend of ours, Astral.
Yeah.
And I was asking around because I've been doing a fairly long, month and a half long series with Thomas 777 about the occult. And I was doing some research and came across a few shadowy groups, asking around about these groups sort of related to the occult, at least obliquely. And your name came up, right? There's sort of a legendary Twitter space you did about it. And so obviously, if people are more interested, you have your own Twitter account, you have a Substack, both of which will be linked. But how do you want to just sort of break this issue down from the top?
So I guess what I'll start with is I wrote a couple articles, admittedly got some writer's block that lasted a bit too long. I need to finish those up at some point. But my interest in covering the Order of Nine Angles and its various offshoots really started before the election because I remembered that the last time Trump was elected, the last time there was a major election in the country, there were people who grew disenfranchised and were sort of drawn into these accelerationist circles. And within these sort of fringes of right-wing accelerationism, there's a religious group, for lack of a better word, an occult organization or belief system, really, I can get into that is really prominent, and it's called the Order of Nine Angles. And I remembered when I was a teenager, they were sort of a minor but very, very notable group within what was then, kind of the alt-right. And so I thought, well, I'm not seeing enough people talk about this, and this is an ideology that I think is poisonous, that somebody ought to kind of address and explain, because a lot of people got into right-wing politics after COVID. And so they were totally unfamiliar with this group. And I was in a group chat and I sort of offhand referenced the Order of Nine Angles and only a couple people got it. And I thought, well, it seems like this is a real problem, that there's not enough awareness of this group. And then also I'm just sort of fascinated by religion, by the study of cult movements, this sort of thing. I have, it's a topic that I'm very familiar with. So I figured I would kind of write some articles and talk about it a bit and kind of raise awareness, sort of break down what these people actually believe, and do it from a right-wing perspective, because all the media coverage tends to focus on the political angle, or we'll get into it. It's a little different with 764, but for the longest time, it only focused on the political angle, and they didn't really focus on what these people actually believe outside of the politics that they claim to hold, which aren't always aligned. So I guess that's kind of my background and what got me interested in talking about this belief system.
Yeah, so I had just kind of heard vague mutterings about O9A. And I think that's the confusing part about it, right? Depending on who you ask, it's, a religious group, a cult, a paramilitary organization. It's very, very vague. And I hate to say it, man, but like my inclination, if you were just sort of describing this to me, would be sort of like, yeah, sure, dude, whatever. Right. But you start to dig in a little bit and you realize not only has this group been around quite some time, but it's been sort of adjacent to some spheres that you and I have found ourselves in, right? Like the infamous cases on Telegram, right? There are a lot of, kind of like O9A and other splinter groups, associated groups on Telegram. And so with like one or two clicks of a hyperlink, you can go from, your friends posting funny memes to something very, very dark. And when I was talking to some of my friends about it, that's what they said. They were like, oh yeah, I like stumbled across, that sort of content before. And again, it's very, very odd from the outside looking in. So as far as I understand, right, this group has sort of a shadowy founding in the late 70s, early 80s in England. Is that correct?
Yes. It's tricky to nail exact dates, especially because you've covered the occult, so you're probably well aware that occult groups like to claim a kind of ancient past. The Order of Nine Angles, in their sort of lore, is actually the combination of three occult groups that existed since before Christianity in Wales and in England. But what likely actually happened is it was founded by somebody named Anton Long in the 1970s. That's a pseudonym. The person actually behind Anton Long is pretty widely accepted to be a gentleman named David Myatt. And he was at the time involved in kind of the underground far right in England, and had a noted interest in the occult. I wrote a whole article where I spend about half the article explaining why they're the same person, because they're very clearly the same person, Anton Long and David Myatt. But at times, Myatt has sort of danced around this and said that he is not Long. But I mean, it's down to like internal letters within the O9A saying Myatt/Long, paintings of Anton Long that happen, or paintings of David Myatt that include blatant Order of Nine Angles symbolism, like the literal logo of the Order of Nine Angles is in the painting, being used on the cover of a book about Anton Long. It's pretty apparent. I've got a whole article about that if people are more interested. But yeah, the general gist is it starts in the mid to late 70s in England and sort of becomes one element of the broader kind of underground esoteric occult far right.
Yeah. So as far as I understand it, right, and we're talking in very, very broad terms, there's sort of an atavistic attraction to the occult, right? Starting in kind of the late 60s through the 70s. And it's kind of hard to say it ever went away, but kind of culminating in the early 90s, right? Depending on where you were in the world. And some of this was sort of, you consider kind of like goofy and aesthetic, right? So like, it was sort of cool and edgy to be associated with those things. So for instance, a lot of kind of prominent bands from the 70s, like Black Sabbath and others, would sort of lean into their connections to figures like Anton LaVey, right? And at least according to some of the books on the topic, basically those guys were doing it as a marketing gimmick, right? It was cynical. It was sort of the it thing to do. Imagine Crystals 10 years ago, right? But that doesn't mean everyone was doing that, right? There was a very sincere interest on a kind of a cultural level into the occult. And so this was one of, a number of groups. I mean, for instance, it's slightly different, but I mean, this is also roughly contemporaneous to Scientology getting very, very big in the UK, right? A little bit earlier. But point is, like, alternative religion, alternative spirituality was sort of in the air at the moment. But I'll throw it back to you, man.
Yeah, that's actually a really nice segue because, so initially when you started seeing, I use certain terms when I write about the Order of Nine Angles. I'll say, for example, audience cult. And what that comes from is studies that really started in the 60s, where there was this kind of academic interest in what was at first called cult movements. That gained a negative connotation. Today, I think the generally accepted term is alternative religious movements, which you also used, but I will sometimes use the terms interchangeably, just because the texts that I remember reading that really broke this down used the terms cult. But, long story short, yeah, there was a very genuine interest in occultism, in alternative spirituality, in sort of what would be called like Eastern mysticism. This is the birth of the New Age movement. And this wasn't all just hippies. I think that often people, and if you're familiar with the internet, right, maybe you know this is different. And increasingly, this is even becoming mainstream, right, is alternative health, alternative spirituality. I sort of say, like, RFK represents the moderate, like, conservative end of that, right? But increasingly, these things are not just the realm of the left. However, the Order 9 Angles is a little different in that it is a organization that called itself a Satanist group. And this is one of these other things you learn about. I saw you did some episodes on black metal. I'm a big fan of black metal. That's another reason I guess I'm fascinated by these guys. Interestingly enough, the band Dissection has a sort of adjacent connection to the Order 9 Angles, if you ever want to look into that. But anyhow, the Order 9 Angles considers itself a satanic organization, but not in the conventional sense. There's a couple different kinds of Satanism, which is another. Go ahead.
This is actually quite relevant because this is when people say like Satanism, they tend to think of like Indiana Jones stuff, right? A guy with horns on his head doing, human sacrifice. And like, don't get me wrong, that's a part of it, but there's multiple groups here, right? You have the kind of intellectual prodigy of Anton LaVey, which is, I mean, if anything, closer related to like objectivism, right? I mean, still, should we say like satanic in a spiritual sense, but in many cases, actually bizarrely like materialist and atheist. And then you also have, which I actually don't fully understand, the distinction between left hand and right hand. Is that a relevant factor here?
Yeah. So the Order 9 Angles would generally be considered a left-hand path group. But yeah, so even within that, there's almost subsets, because there are satanic groups that tend to sort of be what I guess the standard understanding of Satanism is, right? Where you're like, the guy in the Bible, the devil, I like him and I hate God. And that's my belief system. And everything that God doesn't like, I like. The Order of 9 Angles is a little different, actually, because they don't necessarily believe in the Satan of the Bible all the way. They believe in I have an article where I get into their beliefs because they're very strange, but the gist of it would be that we live in kind of the causal world, and there's this sort of acausal realm, I guess, world. There's these sort of spiritual entities, and they say that Satan is a causal human name for one of them, but there are a lot of them, and a lot of them are named after demons. Interestingly, they sort of differ. For example, they describe Baphomet as being a separate entity from Satan and a woman, which is highly unusual. Most people that believe in an entity called Baphomet would believe that Baphomet is either a man or sort of an in-between. They believe that Baphomet is a woman and represents a kind of dark, feminine archetype. And the Order of 9 Angles, broadly speaking, would be an accelerationist group that draws on a combination of Satanism, although they don't often like to admit this. They actually have some writings where they sort of call out Anton LaVey by name as someone they disagree with. They draw on certain types of mysticism, like Eastern mysticism. They draw on ideas from paganism. They draw on even bizarrely an almost Spenglerian view of history. And they even directly borrow some terminology from Spengler, and more specifically Francis Parker Yockey, which is yet another reason I think they're fascinating, because I am someone who's read a decent amount of Francis Parker Yockey, and it's sort of strange to see that terminology used in an alternative religious setting. And so they're principally, the Order 9 Angles is an occult group that believes themselves to be the true Satanists, right? In their eyes, all these other Satanists are either atheists, like jokes, they're moderates, they're not serious. And that was sort of their marketing pitch for the longest time. And it still is. Like, you can even go on websites like Reddit, and when people talk about the Order of Nine Angles, they'll go, oh, well, I'm not one of those guys. Like, I'm a good Satanist. They very consciously like to represent themselves as the sort of villainous. They talk about having sinister energies, using terms for themselves like Noctulian. They very much kind of, and one text I read used the term vampiric. They very much consciously embrace the villainous imagery that Satanism has. And arguably, that is their connection to the Satan of the Bible, is that they see that as a sort of dark guideline that they should adhere to. They don't necessarily they don't necessarily believe that there is a God and a devil and they like the devil. They just more like the character of the devil in the text as a sort of real in their eyes, but a causal kind of entity that they worship. Does any of that make sense? I know I'm kind of unloading a lot on you.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you brought up the connections to Yaki, because that's something I was noticing during my research as well. But the other thing is like this bizarre, like you almost have to like chop a bunch of adjectives together, but it's like this Nietzschean doomer accelerationist. Like that sounds stupid, right? To kind of put those three words together, but it's a very distinct kind of system of thought, right? So I sort of know where this is going, but people who are listening might be a little confused. If you had to answer the question of, well, why does this matter, right? Are the Order of Nine Angels, are these just a bunch of guys, sitting in chat rooms, talking about philosophy? Like, how does this actually affect anything other than simply being like one of many bizarre religious groups?
So I guess one of the biggest reasons why, and something that I really focus on, and something that has kind of drawn a lot of attention from people on the right who are aware of them, is the Order of Nine Angles has a sort of, like a lot of occult groups, they're an initiatory group, right? And there are levels of initiation, and there are sort of qualifications you have to meet. Unusually, by the standards of an occult group, at least in its original incarnation, and that's something I'll get into a bit later, is there are sort of generations of the Order of Nine Angles. There are physical requirements. You have to be able to ruck or run within certain physical standards. There are sort of ritual requirements. And most importantly to people who are in the right, they have something called an insight roll, where for a certain amount of time, they have to join a group or a practice that they don't necessarily agree with, and kind of infiltrate it and push it towards their broader accelerationist goals. Now, the reason why is because, at least in the original Anton Long incarnation, they believe that there are eras of history. This is what they kind of draw from Spengler and Yaki. And currently we're in the Western Aeon. And they say these eras last for about 2,000 years. And so in about 400 years, we enter the there are various terms they use. Some will say the Aeon of Fire. Some will say the Aryan Aeon. Regardless, and that's something I guess I should quickly address as well. So, and then I'll loop back to the insight roll. The Order of Nine Angles uses certain, sometimes you'd say far right language. One of the biggest examples would be their year system. They have, you'll often see in their texts, when they talk about dates, they'll say YF. And that means different things to different people. But one that certainly seems to line up is Year of the Fuhrer, because their dating system starts the year Hitler was born. Now, there are others that will say it is, I believe, Year of the Phaeon. I'd have to double check. Year of Fire, that will sort of detach from that. But there are certain Order of Nine Angles Nexions, which is what they kind of use as a term for their subset groups, that are more explicitly far right, at least in their rhetoric. And there are ones that are not. there are allegedly some that are even left wing. The thing about the Order of Nine Angles is it's what you would call an audience cult. It really, meaning that most of their practitioners are solo or in small groups, and it is very decentralized. There's not some central figure that is controlling things. I mean, broadly speaking, you could argue for a while, Myatt, I mean, he was the first guy, so he wrote a lot of stuff. But now there's a great deal of independent literature that is kind of in their broader literary canon. And there's no like set, you must believe this and oppose this principles. So because of that, there are subsets that really focus on trying to join and become involved with the far right. That actually started in the earliest Nexion. I mentioned earlier, but David Myatt wasn't just writing satanic texts and short stories, if you can believe it, like sort of fiction short stories starring Niners, which is another term they use for themselves, doing human sacrifices and waging a guerrilla war against the government and having, quite frankly, badly written, smutty encounters. But he was also involved with Combat 18, which was a sort of particularly infamous underground right-wing group in England, far-right group. And he actually wrote a text that advocated for kind of violent action. And so the first time he got media attention was when a gentleman set nail bombs. And this was, it was found that he possessed some stuff written by Myatt in a non-Satanist context. And so where this becomes relevant to the right is their insight role. One of the ones that they explicitly recommend in early texts is joining a far-right organization. And this is a group that wants to join organizations and often push those organizations towards violence. So the consequence of that is a lot of their texts will sort of reference joining far-right groups and then trying to convince those far-right groups to engage in violence, which is something that I don't agree with and I think a real threat. And repeatedly, this has actually happened. So that, I know I kind of went on a couple tangents there, but I wanted to establish, especially the audience cult thing is really important because it can be very tricky to talk about the Order of Nine Angles because if you read enough of their texts, some of them will be contradictory and they will be written by different people. And some of them are just compilations of letters sent to associated magazines. So if it seems unclear, their politics, if you're wondering why some of them seem to be far right, some of them seem to be apolitical, some of them actually seem to be kind of left wing, that would be why. But especially for the far right, that tends to be the kind of politics that they try to insert themselves into the most. And I guess one other quick thing I'll say before I move on, just to kind of establish a baseline belief. The Order of Nine Angles believes in rituals. If you read the early texts, some of the rituals are very elaborate. I am skeptical that they have ever been done. They involve a human sacrifice. They involve like 30 people. They involve just a level of coordination that I don't think has ever existed in their organization. But they place a lot of emphasis on this kind of masculine, feminine dichotomy and practicing both. And so another thing you'll notice is when you read, especially older Order of Nine Angles texts, they can often seem almost feminist, which would kind of seem to contradict the fact that sometimes in the same books, you will see far right ideology referenced. But that's where that kind of comes in, is there's this idea in the Order of Nine Angles, and it's not only the Order of Nine Angles, there's other occult groups that believe this and other religious belief systems, that men are better at kind of the physical tasks, the sort of violence, the accelerationist type angle, and women in their eyes are more naturally attuned to the esoteric, the spiritual, the magical, and they see it as a duty that their members embrace both. So that's just me kind of laying out, I guess, a lot, kind of a basic history, why it's relevant to the right, and some of their more important beliefs I think that you have to grasp.
Yeah, there's several things there. When I was doing some research on this, one of the things that it comes up constantly is like, you're right. This is a completely decentralized group, at least in modernity. And there's sort of a debate as to, you know, how many sort of real members there are, because, you know, there's sort of this initiation process, right? Which is, depending again on which kind of cell it is, can be very, very long. And, you know, obviously you mentioned the sort of physical fitness part, but also there's sort of like it'd be like a blooding process, right? Where it's like you sort of have to, you know, record evidence of yourself is doing some sort of crime, right? You know, I think there's an infamous screenshot where it's like, you know, a bricking, a beating, a stabbing, or, you know, one of another things, right? And the other part is that by virtue of sort of making it a requirement to start other organizations, join other organizations, there's sort of this like viral nature of it, right? Where an organization, or like, and you particularly see this on like, you know, Telegram or Discord servers, whatever, right? Kind of a constrained group, where it'll almost be like infected and taken over. And then, and I don't remember the exact terminology, but there's like different terms for basically like members and then almost like thralls, you know, kids you have kind of doing your bidding, and you get them to do bad things, but they're not sort of initiate members. Do I have that correct, man?
Yes, and what you're referencing, especially with Discord, is the most prominent modern offshoot is a group called 764. And so, just to quickly lay this out, you have the Order of Nine Angles, which is what I've mainly been discussing. And because it's so decentralized, there are certain figures that will gain prominence, or certain writings that will become prominent, that are not from Anton Long / probably David Myatt. I mean, well, definitely. But for example, a really prominent, I almost like to talk about how there's 3 generations in a way, at least in America. You have the early Order of Nine Angles stuff, which is the most esoteric, the most, I don't want to necessarily compliment it, but it's along the lines of certainly an extreme, and there's an emphasis on violence and criminality, but you read the texts and they read like occult texts. And then kind of the next generation, most infamously, was an American Nexion called the Temple of Blood, which was led by a gentleman named Sutter, who became involved with a group called the Atomwaffen Division. And I think this is where a lot of the modern Order of Nine Angles offshoots sort of derive from, is the Temple of Blood in particular. And my understanding is that there's a falling out between the Temple of Blood, which now is no longer a thing, really, although its offshoots are certainly still around, and the original Order of Nine Angles. But you get the Temple of Blood, and then the Temple of Blood really starts to kind of gain online infamy for its connection to Atomwaffen and to Telegram, Discord. And then you get kind of this third generation, 764. And 764, I guess the differences would be that Temple of Blood, for the most part, really emphasized violent accelerationism. It was a lot of their texts relate to this. It was more kind of explicitly geared towards the far right. 764 retains some of that, but it's almost like it's in a new realm of criminality, and not one that's any better than murder, and which is the distribution of CSAM, which is child sexual abuse material, blackmail, sextortion, this sort of thing. And it's almost like with each generation, there is a degeneration, because if you read texts from the Temple of Blood, they are not as heady. They are not as, there's a lot less strange, like the sinister acausal realm shall unleash the energy of, and there's a lot more just naked violence and strange illustrations. And then by the time you get to 764, a lot of the ritual element seems to have been removed. at least from what I can gather. That's where you start seeing the most, people cutting themselves, that sort of thing. But at that point, it's almost like the occultism has become secondary to the aesthetic and the general sort of culture around it.
I'm glad you brought up the aesthetic, because that's definitely a relevant part of it. Like if you look at their publications, and I can't quite decide my feelings on this woman. Have you read any of? I think she goes by like BX on Substack.
Yes, BX on X. I'm familiar with her.
Yeah. So she covers stuff, and her stuff is, I'll put it this way, largely well researched, in the sense that there's a lot of citations. She shows her work, but also like half of the articles are just complete and total wastes of time. It'll be like, oh, I was sitting down with my daughter eating blueberry bagels. And then like 3 paragraphs later, something relevant, And so it's kind of hard to tell how seriously to take her, right? But one of the things she's always talking about is like the shooter core aesthetic, right? And how, many of these people who go on to commit crimes are sort of blending together, these different, aesthetic moments. So for instance, like one of the really infamous ones is like, the OK symbol in the school bathroom, right? Taking that photo. It's now like an iconic thing. You're doing the meme, right? Similar to like yelling subscribe to PewDiePie before you start your rampage, right? And so like a lot of these, occult things are brought in almost as kind of like visual seasoning. So for instance, right, the thing that really sent me down this rabbit hole was the most recent, anti-Catholic trans shooter, right? Who featured symbology for both 7.64 and 09A on their rifle. Admittedly, in addition to a bunch of other schizophrenic stuff that was completely unidentifiable, right? Far left, far right, racist, anti-racist, whatever. And so like, to your point, right? Like the aesthetics that you see with 7.64 and like sort of the denigrated version of that, like it is super schizophrenic and sort of just like every edgy thing put together in a blender. If you see what I'm getting at.
Yes, I would agree with you. And I talked about this some on a podcast with I did recently, but generally, yeah, there is this aesthetic, and a lot of what it's almost in a way, it's almost like a perfect representation of kind of how the internet has made irony everything. Because for some of these shooters, the most recent one you talked about, the 3 that people have kind of linked is you've got it was the black kid, and in his manifesto, at times he's racist, at times he's like anti-black, at times he's a black supremacist. He has memes referencing the Order of 9 Angles. He has the same as all these shooters, the shout outs to different YouTubers. Then you had the girl, his name was Solomon, and then it was, I believe, Samantha Rupno, I want to say. And then this most recent trans shooter. And yes, so that is an element in this, is especially by the time you get into people like that who maybe aren't even involved in 7.64, but they're familiar with 7.64. Because the kind of shooter core, edgy internet communities have an overlap with both people who are in 7.64 and people who think it's funny to reference the Order of 9 Angles, to reference Adam Waffen, to reference 7.64. There's almost an ironic component to it, where they will purposely sometimes play up that imagery because it's like an in-joke with them. And there's sort of certain aesthetics that are, like, for example, there used to be this artist called Dark Foreigner, and his art style is one that they will all parody. I, in my articles, parody the art style for the picture I have at the beginning of each article, because when you see it, you will instantly recognize it. I should have used the version of my profile picture I made that's a parody of that for this, now that I think about it, where it's like black and white and red, and there's blood spatter, and the eyes are glowing, and they've got the skull masks and these sort of edgy font that's meant to look like it's like dripping blood, and it's very purposely edgy. And I think that on some level, the Order of 9 Angles has always been that, but particularly Temple of Blood was where that really kind of escalated, where there's this infamous book written by or published by them called Iron Gates. And Iron Gates is, I would not recommend reading it. It's sort of written in the style of teenage fan fiction, but it's primarily about rape and murder and torture. And just, you read it and you get the impression that this is a guy trying to write the edgiest thing he can, right? He's trying to touch on everything society says he shouldn't. And that is where you almost mentioned, I also hesitate to call it Nietzschean, but it is sort of, in a way, this emphasis on breaking society's morality. You often see this in left-hand path groups. And I try not to tar all the people who are interested in this stuff in a negative light. I try to present things as honestly as I can. And I think that, yeah, by the time you get to these modern shooters, it almost doesn't matter if they're actually in 764. Because what 764 believes is sort of unclear. You've got Hispanic guys like writing in runes with their blood on a picture of the Zodiac killer. I don't really know what that has to do with right-wing politics, but they will throw that imagery in as well. It's almost, yeah, an attempt to be as edgy as possible, as immoral as possible. And within those communities, if you do commit a violent act, and there are, I should clarify that it's not just 764. There's a group that's prominent in, I say prominent, but that the sort of equivalent in Eastern Europe is a group called the Maniac Murder Cult, which has
which is
a name
connected to that.
Go
is
ahead.
it officially or just tangentially Is it officially or just tangentially connected to those teenage Ukrainian serial killers? I can never remember the exact name that they go by because it's Ukraine.
Oh.
You know the ones I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about. And I remember I hadn't gotten to that point in the article series yet. So I remember going, oh, interesting, noting that down and then not confirming.
So just for a little bit of context, they're called the Maniacs of something. But it was actually 3 kids, sort of 2 hitters and then 1 guy with a camera, who allegedly murdered like over a dozen people. They are behind the creation of the infamous shock video. I think it's 3 guys, 1 hammer, right? But what was interesting is, they were arrested, convicted. The cameraman, I think, got off with a slap on the wrist because he hadn't actually been recorded doing anything. But the 2 kids, as part of their defense, basically alleged that they had been paid a lot of money over the internet to basically record these crimes and upload them. Again, these are crazy people, so don't believe everything they say. But I thought that was a particularly interesting detail. And if I'm not mistaken, the group you're talking about, they take their name from those killers, but it's unknown as if there's an actual connection there past just the aesthetic. Well,
that is sort of where you get into another wrinkle in the story of the Order 9 Angled offshoots, the modern offshoots. And that is, in Eastern Europe, there has been some attention on the Maniac Murder Cult in particular, because it has members that are Ukrainian and members that are Russian. Obviously, your listeners are well aware there's quite a situation going on between those 2 countries right now. And one of the lines about the war from some in Russia is that they're fighting against Satanism. Another is that they're fighting against Nazism. When you have Satanists who also call themselves Nazis that are located in your countries, there is sort of an impulse to really make a big deal out of that. And so because of this, the Russian government in particular has really tried to crack down on the Order 9 Angles. This is also because, in addition to the teenagers you mentioned, there were some other satanic killers in the past in Russia. And Russia tends to be a more openly religious country than most of the West. So Satanism carries more weight there than it does in most of the Western world as something that the government should really focus on. And so there's a lot that has come out of Russia and Ukraine. The trouble I have is both governments there sort of have an incentive to pin the blame on the other side. And so, or to muddy the waters. So it's very tricky. There's a reason that I mentioned I got writer's block partway through writing my series. And where I hit it was when I got into the modern day. Because once you get into the Order of Nine Angles involvement, specifically through the Temple of Blood in Adam Waffen, you get into the Maniac Murder Cult, you get into 764. Some of these are developing stories. Some of these are stories that are only really reported on by different people who've been arrested or confined to chat rooms on Telegram. You get into a lot of rumor. You start getting into sources that are less academic and more screenshots on kiwi farms, and stuff that reads like propaganda, stuff that doesn't. Because another important thing to talk about is the Order of Nine Angles, in theory, you shouldn't know that someone's part of it. In theory, their members are supposed to be very subtle and not mention this stuff to people. In practice, they're very bad at that, because the kind of person who wants to join the most evil Satanist group in the world tends to be the kind of person that is fairly mentally unstable and will make this stuff known. And especially now with these online groups, you mentioned like the shooter core stuff earlier, there's almost a desire to be associated with it because it's so edgy. And so I always have to walk a weird tightrope that I'm not always good about, because if you play up there are this elite Satanist group that manipulates all these people, that's the image that they want. But at the same time, and often when you actually read their texts, and you're someone like me who, has always been interested in horror movies and in this sort of thing, like, if you're someone who's not familiar with that and you read it, you're like, oh my gosh, they're talking about human sacrifice and murder and this. And then on the other hand, you read some of it and it's so kind of silly and it's written in such a bizarre, comically edgy way. And you're just reading about conjuring a tulpa of a gray alien to like yell at you to commit more crimes. And you're like, this is just stupid. Like, this is just a joke. And you kind of have to think about it somewhere in the middle. Like, there really is a group called the Maniac Murder Cult. And they really did come up with schemes to poison children with candy. And they really have people associated with their group who have filmed themselves beating or killing people. But on the other hand, they're called the Maniac Murder Cult, and they've got guys going by titles like Commander Butcher, writing about how they're the most evil people in the world and how nobody can comprehend the level of evil that they commit. So it's a very odd dynamic, I guess, to write about. And it's tough to find a tonal balance, because, like I said, you don't want to treat them as a joke, but at the same time, you can't, like you were saying, there are a lot of crazy people, and you can't take all their claims seriously. Like you mentioned earlier, there's an undetermined amount of members, but it's almost certainly less than whatever they claim. Any of these groups, if they even allude to a membership number, it's never going to be as much as they say it is. And then there's another element to it, which is because it's so decentralized, you have a lot of people who will work it in sort of syncretically with other occult beliefs, or there's a term called religious bricolage, when people sort of combine, pick and choose elements from different religions to create a new belief system. That will sometimes be a factor when you're reading this. I've read texts written by self-proclaimed Order of Nine Angles members that draw heavily from Hinduism. I've read some that draw from esoteric Hitlerism. I've read some that draw from more conventional satanic narratives. I've read ones that are more feminist. I've read ones that are anti-feminist, racist, non-racist. So you have a lot of people who, in an attempt to be edgy, will sort of proclaim themselves to be a Niner. And, there's no real verification system either way. I mean, there's no central authority that says this guy is a Niner, this guy isn't. So it can be very, very tricky to categorize these groups and to get into the nitty gritty, because there's a lot of lying that goes on. There's a lot of rumors that are spread. There are, I would say, maybe smarter members that will purposely spread rumors. There are, I would say, mentally ill people that are just sort of posting their screed online, talking about things that are not real. It can be very tricky. So I kind of went off topic, I guess, from your original point a bit. But yes, there is a connection at least in that there have been satanic murders before in Russia. The Maniac Murder Cult has members in Russia and Ukraine. It absolutely would not shock me if they, in the very least, are claiming lineage from those killings. But I wouldn't be able to tell you if they actually have personal contact with the teenagers that you mentioned. I guess they wouldn't be teenagers now. And it wouldn't really shock me either way, to be honest with you, because there is a kind of fetishization in these really extreme online communities of serial killers and school shooters and terrorists. And sometimes even to the point, I remember reading one 09A sort of thing where they were idolizing Ted Bundy as a national socialist. And that might seem kind of strange because you might wonder what the political angle of Ted Bundy is. I don't really know if there is one, but that's sort of the thing, is these people will just cobble together
The
things
world's
that they
most
see as
homophobic man.
yeah, I mean, I guess he didn't kill men, so maybe that.
Who knows? I don't know. I guess in all seriousness, that's what makes it very difficult to dig into this, right? Because it turns out these guys have no compunction about lying, right? And they sort of have every incentive to make themselves as ancient, scary, and influential as possible. And a lot of the coverage that you see in sort of more mainstream sources, right? Like, actual websites, not like a Substack, comes at this from the angle of basically child safety, right? Particularly 764 has been connected to a bunch of weird stuff on like Discord, obviously, but also on Roblox. Have you ever dug into this?
A bit, yes. They 764, that in particular is, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I guess I'll get into it some. The 764 stuff is where I mentioned that kind of degeneration, and that's really where it kind of hits its peak, where it seems to almost be, and you can kind of go back and forth on this. Are they using the ostensible satanic ideology as an excuse for why they collect child sexual abuse material and blackmail and encourage people to cut themselves? Are they doing that stuff because of their beliefs? Is it a blend? I tend to lean towards that. But yeah, 764 has really gained prominence recently because of, I'll just be frank, some of their members, have been linked to violence, and some of them have been linked to child pornography rings, online child pornography rings. And so and one of the primary methods that they would use is finding vulnerable, sort of mentally ill teenagers, especially on Discord, but also, to my knowledge, Roblox and Minecraft to some extent, and trying to get in contact with them through that. I will note that that's yet again where things get kind of strange, because, I mean, obviously all of this is strange, but 764 groups have targeted teenagers that are interested in extremist right-wing ideology. They've targeted transgender teenagers, non-white teenagers, just any sort of people that they see as vulnerable. And how much, by the time you get into some of the 764 stuff, how much of any of this is guided by some kind of spiritual practice is unclear. I mean, even Maniac Murder Cult, which is linked to 764, the groups are certainly at least have some overlap online or travel in similar circles. It seems like some of them are doing some kind of rituals. It seems like some of them are just generally being bad people and are almost just interested in the aesthetic or the reputation that saying you're part of this, super elite underground satanic network carries, But yeah, I would say a lot of the mainstream coverage now, it really gets into the child safety angle, which I think is good. But that's only the most recent iteration, and that's only the most prominent recent iteration. The coverage.
This is, sorry, I just want to interject because And you probably had the same experience where it's like you start digging and you find something that just seems like absurd. Like there's no way this can be real. And you kind of keep digging and keep digging. Like the thing with Roblox, which for anyone, let's just say above the age of 30, is sort of like an open source browser based game, right? It's designed so that you can, with a relatively limited IQ and limited hardware, make your own games effectively. They kind of run the gamut. Very popular with children. I think it's free to play. I never played it, right? But point is, obviously, as you can imagine, that leads to a lot of concerns with grooming because all of these servers are privately run and privately developed. But there's been this birth of this bizarre, again, semi-ironic cult on Roblox called Spawnism. And it seems as if a large part of it was associated with a 764 affiliated group, basically trying to get kids into this like ironic joke cult to pull them into, basically to pull them off site into Discord groups, into Telegram channels, and groom them. And that sounds really weird. And it's even weirder when you look at it and it looks like Roblox. But people associated with this group are very, very widespread on the internet.
So Spawnism, to my knowledge, yes, Spawnism is connected to 764. There's another sort of ideological influence on 764. I mentioned specifically Temple of Blood style Order of Nine Angles practice. There's also a group called Cult, which is like CVLT. And all of these groups are connected to other sort of shadowy internet subcultures like the shooter core stuff, the com on Telegram, these sort of networks of internet criminals and hyper edgelords, basically. And so Spawnism and the Roblox connection, I think I would kind of agree. It's almost one of the most strikingly strange things about this sort of modern iteration. But at the same time, it's really not even unique. There were rumors going back to the Order of Nine Angles involvement with Atomwaffen that they had some connection to Roblox. And I haven't really fully elaborated done my research on that, because until this more recent 764 connection to Roblox, I never would have thought that you would recruit people for a cult or child exploitation, blackmail Satanism ring on Discord through Roblox. But you certainly can, because the tactics are constantly evolving. Early Order of Nine Angles texts will sometimes talk about joining groups that, to be honest, don't really exist in the modern world in the same way. They'll mention join a skinhead gang, join a environmental terror organization. I think that both of those, while they certainly still exist, are certainly less prominent. Some will say just join a local street gang. But increasingly, thanks to the internet, a lot of their tactics have shifted away from joining in-person organizations and have shifted towards joining internet communities. And that was sort of the thing that really got me interested in this topic, was the fact that they really do act as an insidious element online, and they will absolutely try to infiltrate online groups. And for a time, their target of choice was the internet far right. Now it seems like, at least with 764, a lot of this seems to be on Discord. Telegram is pretty much the constant throughout, and any sort of edgy internet group is going to try to use Telegram when they can. So that's where you'll sometimes see this imagery, references to this. But yeah.
Well, dude, we've run out of time. This was a ton of fun, man. I'll have to have you back on. I went on a little bit of a spur grant here and there, so it wasn't the most organized episode. But dude, this was a ton of fun. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you. And I'll say the same. I have a tendency to ramble. And so I know that I kind of went on some separate side topics here and there, but No, I agree with you. This has been I always like talking about this stuff. Well, I say like talking about it. It's not the most cheery topic, but I think it's an important one, and it's a really, really interesting one. So
Yeah, it's definitely darkly interesting. And it's one of those things where you sort of wonder why this isn't more often discussed, right? It feels like something that would be, like Manson or like, any of these other things, like highly marketable. People would be interested in it. And for one reason or another, it's not. But dude, before we go, where can people find you?
So you could find me on X or on Substack, and it's both at the same handle that you're seeing on screen, AgNONsis, so AgNONsis. And the anon is capitalized. I thought I was doing a clever pun, but saying AgNONsis just sort of doesn't sound quite right. So I've sort of adopted AgNONsis. I think it sounds a little better. But yeah, that's where you can find me. I haven't put out anything on Substack too recently. I need to get back into that. Real life is a way of stopping you from writing articles. But I've still got all my sources. I've still got all my rough drafts. So I should try to update that soon. I have two types of writing on there. One would be kind of a series on the Order of Nine Angles, vaguely chronologically, from the right, viewed from the right. And then the other is just sort of random articles I put out about different things I find interesting. So.
Well, sure thing. Those will be linked down in the description. As far as my stuff, The Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to podcasts. Been getting some confusion. As you guys know, obviously you can get the episodes early and ad-free on Patreon, Subscribestar, Substack, Gumroad. But I'm getting complaints that if you subscribe to Substack, you don't get the episodes in your podcast feed anymore on your podcast app. That's a feature. You just have to turn it on. Look up how to do so. It'll take you like 2 seconds. So not a problem, easy to solve. Alternatively, if you don't want to do that, you could throw me a few bucks directly. Check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Again, man, it's a great time. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.
Good night.